Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Parmenius podcast with Bernard Wills. This week, we're going to be guestless, but we're going to discuss some interesting new posts that Bernard has put out on his blog, which we'll link to in the description here in the YouTube video. So, what are we talking about today?
I guess we're talking about progress.
Progress. Yeah.
Yes.
Progress. So, in particular, these two new ones. It's been both of these new posts that you've made. Post-progress and farewell to progress, ?
Yeah.
So what's the problem with progress?
Well, let me hark back to something from, I don't know, this must have been my teens. Okay. I picked up a book, and it's under, different editions have different titles, but the title I know it under is Cosmos and History, the Myth of Eternal Return, okay, by a Romanian scholar of religion, Mircea Eliade. Okay. Eliade is a wonderful name, by the way, because it means son of the sun.
Oh, wow.
As in Helios, the sun.
Okay.
Yeah. And this was the first work that introduced me to the notion of eternal return. Okay. And of course, that is a core concept for Nietzsche. Okay. So the notion of eternal recurrence is the notion of time as cyclical recurrence. Okay. So in, various ancient cultures, there is a conception of the world as a process of cyclical return or reversion upon itself. Okay. And that's woven into the structure of mythology. It's woven into the structure of, ritual activity. It's even woven in certain ways into the structures of politics and society, right? So what we are engaged in is the Great Return. I want to put it that way, okay? And that's a cyclical return. And Eliade made me aware that there are rival conceptions about the nature of time, okay? So time might go in a circle, time might go forwards, time might go backwards, to put it just in a very simple and direct way, okay? And there are political and social stances which embody these differing conceptions of time. Okay. So a kind of conservative political stance is founded upon, the myth of the golden age. Okay. Back in the 50s when everything was better, back in the 20s when everything was better, back in the 1800s when everything was better, and so on and so on, right? So that's structured as a kind of myth of return. How do we renew ourselves? We reconnect with our past in, a vital and new way, okay? And certainly for a program like Humanities, that's part of the picture, right? It's like, no, to focus on the challenges today, we need to go back to Plato and focus on what he focused on and try to bring that forward in some sense, right? So, but we all know the limits of that, right? Because people fall into toxic nostalgia traps, right? And then you get this kind of vengeful conservative populism, right? So we know that the myth of the golden age is dangerous, okay? Or the notion of reversion, of return, of renewal by a return to the past can sometimes be used by bad actors to fuel deadly nostalgia cults that, right, kill people, okay? So, then on the other hand, we have, Dostoevsky in The Underground Man, he calls it the Golden Palace, right? And we could kind of call that the myth of the Golden Palace, if you like, right? That through politics, through technology, through economics, through whatever it is, right? We will, going forward, create a human community from which basically all the fundamental contradictions and all the fundamental contradictions and ambiguities and paradoxes of the human condition will be resolved, right? And then we will have this future race of bright, happy people who lead, trouble-free lives or whatever, right? So there's the myth of the golden age, and then there's kind of the myth of progress, right? The myth of the crystal palace. Okay. And there's various other ways of configuring time in other cultures. And of course, one of the most powerful ones that you and I would be aware of is, of course, Nietzsche, okay? Where he has this notion of eternal recurrence, which is, kind of the philosophical version of, the kind of common therapeutic mantra we hear today: live in the now. Okay? Mm-hmm. Right? Focus yourself in the now, focus yourself in the present, right? And so for that position, myths of the past or fables of the future, right, alienate us in a certain way from what's given to us in the now, what's given to us in the moment, right? And so Nietzsche's way of putting that is, well, eternal recurrence, right? The now in which you are in will forever recur, right? So you are never out of that now. Like, you never transcend this now either into a golden, glorious future or a shining mythical past, right? Because this now that you are in will always be, right? And it will always come back at you in the form of recurrence, right? And so you need this kind of heroic philosophical resolution to embrace the myth of eternal return. Okay? So I don't think, if you're in a university, you and I are in a university, right? We're pretty good at avoiding toxic nostalgia traps about the past, right? Because we have critical historians who examine the past, and one of the things that they do is explode the various myths about it. Okay? But on the other hand, I think a lot of people are, in a direct and possibly not sufficiently reflective way, held by, or even perhaps trapped by, notions of progress, okay? Meaning exactly what Nietzsche means, right? The life in the now, life in the present is instrumental to realizing some kind of future, okay? And of course, that future is not going to be a dystopian future. That future is going to be a future in which, I don't know, we've gotten rid of racism, right? Or we've gotten rid of religion, or we've gotten rid of some embarrassing or inconvenient class of people, or whatever, right? So people today, they frequently refer to themselves as progressives. I sometimes refer to myself as a progressive, and I'm sure that you do too. Like, if you're a social democrat, for instance, okay? The kind of label under which you describe your social democracy is progressivism or progress. Okay? Yet progress is, in certain of its manifestations, or at least has been in certain of its manifestations, a shady idea. Right? Why did we expropriate all this land from indigenous people in North America? In order to bring about progress. Okay? So progress seems to involve the erasure and disappearance of something. It seems to involve the erasure and disappearance of something that's an inherent or perhaps even ontological obstacle to progress, right? And in the past, at least, that's been directly genocidal. Okay? Who's standing in the way of the Crystal Palace? Who's standing in the way of the golden and glorious future? The kulaks in Ukraine are, or the indigenous people in North America are, right? So it is a myth that encodes within itself, or embodies within itself, an implicit violence that can become an explicit violence. Okay? And we've seen that happen in the 20th century. We've seen that happen in the 19th century. Okay? Yet we still all call ourselves progressives, and we still all think about progress, or think about what we are doing as progressive, or bringing about progress, or ushering in or shepherding in some kind of future, right? And I wonder, or I ask myself sometimes, in what sense that kind of framing can blind us to what's going on in the present. Okay? I don't know, Jordan. But, Is this making sense to you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things that really spoke to me about what you've just kind of initiated here and then in your blog was this. Okay, let's just speak more generally instead of criticizing progressivism, for example.
And I'm not here to criticize anybody.
Yeah,
right. Like this isn't an
in.
attack on any individual or
Certainly
even an
not.
attack on anything. Right.
That's right. Yeah.
What I'm trying to do is, bring our attention to a certain kind of framing we casually assume, and we so casually assume it that we don't probe what the problems and pitfalls of it might be.
Yeah. So
Right.
let's speak, if we can, generally about political movements. So you say in your piece, political movements have shape and therefore impose boundaries.
Yeah.
So boundaries are kind of crucial to what we're talking about here.
Sure. Some people are in, some people are out.
Yeah.
Yep.
So to be progressive, just like any other political movement, we know that the strict boundary of, the conservative movements or say nationalistic movements, those boundaries are explicitly laid out. Often. So.
And by the way, that's one of the strengths of that kind of movement. The boundaries are clear, right?
Clear.
So if there are people who want firm, clear boundaries, right? Well, this guy's a Hungarian, that guy's a non-Hungarian, right?
Yeah.
And that's something you can latch onto, and that's like something you can order yourself practically in relationship to in a direct and clear way, okay? And so many people prefer that kind of nationalist politics, okay? Mm-hmm. And they seem to prefer it even if it contradicts or goes against their own material interests.
Yes, which you've spoken about before.
Jordan.
Oh, thank you. So, but that's exactly kind of getting to the crux of this, isn't it? Because you do go to great lengths not to say, let's say, for example, what is it, liberatory movements and these kind of emancipatory projects. Yeah. This isn't what's being criticized. It's the underlying notion of progressivism as distinct from these other basic human failures in any political movement. Right? So that's how do we cut into that? So you spoke at length about the boundaries, and instead of it being an explicit boundary, there would be a kind of an implicit or tacit advance of categories of boundary setting and kind of erasure. Mm-hmm. Erasure is a different thing. You said the myth of erasure. We can get into your four myths. But so we all know the kind of the shift towards in and out groups in a progressive context today. Yeah. And it's this, it's been termed various things. What do you think we can do to discuss this without stepping into some kind of crazy, loony nostalgia?
Yes, okay. Because there is a certain conservative narrative that I don't buy, and I don't think you buy it, right? Which is the narrative of decline. Like, that's another narrative. Okay?
Yes.
We are in a period of profound civilizational decline in which we can't enforce clear standards of truth and falsity or right and wrong because presumably neo-Marxists or other people are destabilizing all those categories that are necessary for civilization, and they're producing chaos. And look, the young are full of anxiety. They're full of mental illness and unease about their gender and whatnot. We have to return to some kind of age of clear civilizational standards. Okay. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, the problem is, well, when was that age, right? You can go back to any age you want to think about, and like civilized standards, the nature of civilized standards, the nature of values or whatever are being contested in those ages too. Okay. So what is it you're going back to is always kind of a difficult question. Now, I don't accept a simple narrative of decline in our case. Okay, so to that extent, I agree with the people who would call themselves progressives. Okay, in the sense that there are fundamental shifts of power, right, going on in our society as we speak, right? Because shifts of power are always going on in every society. Okay, so centers of power, centers of assumed privilege are always going to be challenged by outsiders in some sense, right? And the British historian Toynbee had a wonderful word for that. No one remembers Toynbee anymore, but it's like I read him when I was a kid. It's one of those books you found in the library or a book of the month club or whatever. He said that in any society there are internal proletariats, right? So people who don't participate in an uncomplicated way in the civic rituals of a particular society. Okay, so they're outsiders in some sense, right? And of course, an outsider is always a potential threat. Okay, So a classic example of that is this is a kind of historical example Toynbee would go to, right? He'd say, well, look, when the Arab invaders took over Northern Africa, when they took over Egypt, when they took over Syria, the reason they were able to do it is because the occupants of those countries, vis-a-vis the center of Byzantine power in Constantinople, were an internal proletariat, so the so-called Copts, right? And other groups who were separated from the Orthodox Church, right? And so what an internal proletariat does is, well, it looks at power A and it looks at power B, and it says, well, I don't give a damn which, right? I don't give a damn if the Byzantines rule us or the Arabs rule us, because no difference to me. Okay? And in fact, the Arabs might be offering us a slightly better deal. So you throw the gates of Damascus open to the, Arab armies and so on, right? So in other words, there's always a tension in any society between people who have deeply internalized the civic rituals of a certain society and people on the outside or people on the fringe who can't internalize those rituals. Okay? So we are as a society at the moment, in the process of rearranging the inside and the outside, right? Who is the participant in the civic ritual and who is the internal proletariat? That's being redefined in a certain sense, right? And it's being redefined, in my opinion at least, okay, on the basis of fundamental principles of equity and justice. Okay? Now, there's all kinds of ways in which empirically that's going to look like a decline, right? Because yes, suddenly standards are in flux, standards are in play, right? Do I correct this person's grammar? Or is that some kind of act of oppression that I'm doing, right? But if I don't correct their grammar, they'll write nonsense. What do I do? Okay? So as that kind of adjustment goes on, right, anyone who wants to spin a myth of decline can, right? Because, of course, the people engaged in that kind of rearrangement of the power relationships of society, well, they'll overcorrect, right? Some of them will be fueled by resentment. Other people will be, acting out because they're processing some kind of deeply internalized trauma. Other people will just be grifters. Like there's people who will game that process because there's people who will game any process, and so on and so forth, right? So you're going to have this confused period, and that in the confusion of that period, it's going to look like decline. And so you will get a kind of reaction to something before. Okay, so you'll get a Peterson or something, right? Mm-hmm. So that's all part of the process. That's all part of the struggle of civilized living, right? So I don't frame that necessarily in terms of decline. Okay, so before we had a paradise of free speech. Now we have all these, codes of speech, right, that limit what people can say and that limit what people can argue in a certain so, right? Okay. Now, I suppose my position is that with any process like this, you have to understand the opportunity and the danger. As was that Holderlin, the German poet? The opportunity is the danger. The Heidegger likes to quote.
Yes, that is
Holderlin or somebody.
Very nice.
So what's the opportunity and what's the danger? Well, okay. Right, one of the dangers of this process, or at least some of the dangers of this process, come from what I label the four myths. Okay? Mm-hmm. Exactly as a conservative narrative of decline can lead us to miss what's going on, okay, in our current readjustments, so can myths of progress, if they frame themselves in certain kinds of traditional ways that actually lead us to not understand the present. Okay, and so I mentioned four. Okay, so there's
I have them here if you'd like me to read them to you.
Yeah, sure. So the myth
of the exponential curve.
Exponential curve.
Would you like to go each one by one, or just
we'll just do one by one.
Yeah, great.
Right? Okay. So you see what I mean by an exponential curve?
The idea of mathematizing our progress.
Yeah.
These explicit, like you mentioned, the speed of airplanes.
Yeah, the speed of which is this silly, innocuous example.
Yes.
But if you apply that same thing to other things, it's not so innocuous.
Like the exponential growth curve and Marxist critique of capitalism.
Capital, right? So, so an exponential curve is like, well, if we have X amount of freedom now, well, 100 years from now, we'll have Y amount of freedom.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
If we have X amount of prosperity now, we'll have Y amount of prosperity, right? And so on and so on. So everything is framed as an exponential growth curve. Okay? Now, it doesn't work that way. Okay, because we're not going to get Mach 6 airplanes. there's no reason for the rate of speed of an airplane to increase according to the curve that it, was describing, say, from World War I to the end of the Cold War. Okay. And of course, one of the reasons is, airlines have figured out that, to get higher speeds of air travel, you need certain kinds of aerodynamic shapes, and you can't stuff as many passengers in those shapes. Your profits are going to go down. The Concorde problem, right? The idea that, say, the Concorde, the Mach 1.7 or Mach 2 airliner is going to cut your travel time by X number of hours to New York. Okay. And then eventually, as the Concorde is replaced by even faster airliners, you'll be getting from London and New York in, 20 minutes or something absurd. Okay. Right. However you conceive that. Okay. Well, it turns out you can't make money in a supersonic airliner because it has to be slender. Right. You need a certain aerodynamic shape, and you can't stuff enough people in that shape, right? So what airlines have done now have pegged the speed. They basically pegged the speed of airliners at something like 585 miles per hour, because that's the speed at which you have maximum fuel efficiency. And if you go any faster, you'll burn too much fuel and you'll burn through your profits and so on. Okay, so that's kind of an innocuous example. But when we take that notion or myth of an exponential curve, okay, and apply it to something like resource extraction, right? Like you immediately see that that's ecocidal and destructive. Okay. And it's an idea that it's shaping our thinking there in a way that's leading us or making a preposterous conclusion seem simple and inevitable, right? That we can, just infinitely extract and so, and when we're done extracting resources from this planet, we'll just go extract resources from the asteroids and so on and so forth, right? So the notion is that a process is in place of technological development which will always curve upward. Okay? Process is in place of resource extraction and economic growth and prosperity that will always curve upward. Okay? There's no reason to think, like there is no rational reason at all to think that, right? There's no rational reason to think that asteroid mining will ever be profitable, okay? Given the difficulty of traveling in outer space, right? Okay. There's no reason to think, for instance, that, well, if we run out of resources on Earth, we'll just go to Mars. Because going to Mars actually is fantastically difficult, right?
Yeah.
Right? And it's difficult in ways that it's very hard to see what the potential solutions are, okay? Which isn't to say no one will ever go to Mars, but if you're banking on access to Martian resources being the inevitable product of a certain exponential curve in growth and development and technology, that's an awful gamble to take, because you could really, and like Elon Musk is taking that gamble, right? Like, we can't go to Mars now, but just give me 5 years. We'll, it's like, we'll get the bugs out, right?
Yes, and so that's like, it's a direct parallel of the same mythology, because the right wing, kind of pop, right? I mean, Elon Musk will make fun of the or I think Aaron Bastani wrote the book Fully Automated Luxury Communism.
Yeah.
Both based on this same myth of the exponential curve that you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, we'll have luxury communism.
Yeah.
Right. Work will be
fully automation.
Fully automated.
Without any.
And then we'll all do what? I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hang out.
We'll all hang out. We'll do what Mark says. We'll go fishing in the afternoon and read Homer in the morning or whatever. Okay.
Sounds quite wonderful.
Wonderful. Yeah. Okay. But we have the environmental movement to tell us, well, that myth doesn't really pan out in a lot of instances, right?
Mm-hmm.
We might have to face the fact that, as a future society, we're going to have to make do with less, right? And how are we going to find meaning in life? How are we going to find purpose? How are we going to find value in lives that are quite possibly going to be more constrained in terms of economic prosperity and technical growth and possibilities than our current world? Okay. And I give thought to that. Okay. Because, there are processes now fossil fuel extraction, they're going to grind to a halt. Right. And even if you're pro oil, even if you're pro Suncor, even if you're pro tar sands, there's only so much of that stuff there. Okay. And if what those people are saying about fossil fuels being so important to the maintenance of our current forms of civilization, well, as access to fossil fuels inevitably declines over the coming centuries, well, right, we aren't going to be able to lead the same lives that we presently lead. Okay? And are we prepared for that? Right? Are we prepared to make the shifts in values and perspectives away from the kind of material comfort we enjoy now to something else? Okay? Mm-hmm. Well, I think the myth of the exponential curve prevents you from confronting that. Okay? So that's one way in which we have a myth of progress, we have a myth of growth, we have a myth of development that maybe blinds us from the thing we most need to think about in the present, right? Which is, a form of life that does not leave so heavy a footprint on the planet we occupy, yet still maintains enough, enough commodiousness or comfort for human decency, right, at some possibly reduced level to what we have now. Okay. Mm-hmm. And maybe something like life expectancy takes a hit. Okay. Or something else takes a hit, right? How are we going to find meaning in a world where, maybe our health looks more like the 19th century Victorians than it does now, right? I don't know, right? And, I don't want to find out, right? Because I like my comfort too, right? Everyone likes their comfort.
Yes.
But, okay, so that's my problem with the myth of exponential growth. I think it's many people's problems. I think a lot of people see, at least see that there's something dazzling about that vision, but there's also something potentially false about it. Mm-hmm. Right? That it's a Faustian delusion, that it's built on some kind of fundamental false consciousness or evasiveness about the world that we live in. Mm-hmm. Okay? So that's myth one.
So, yeah, and that's, to my instinct, the newer kind of mathematization of this myth. I mean, so let's go to an older form of this myth, and a more binary, maybe more simple to put. So you mentioned the myth of the Manichaean struggle of light and dark. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of this old sense, all the way back to Augustine, that there's just two forces in the universe.
Yeah.
And this applies to contemporary politics today, kind of.
City of God and city of man.
City of God and city of man.
Yeah.
And so today, what do we have in the form of this Manichaean myth?
Well, I mean, we have, broadly speaking, two communities that are engaged in the process of mutual excommunication from each other, because each of them thinks it's the city of God and the other is the city of man. Okay?
Exactly.
And of course, what that produces is highly polarized politics. Okay? What that also produces is minoritarian politics, right? Because if you're the city of God, you have to seize the reins of power, okay, to make sure the city of man can't get at you, okay? And so let me put that this way. Okay. If you are I don't know, you're a guy in Alabama. You're a guy in Alberta.
Sure.
Something, whatever. Okay. And you're there with your tiki torch or whatever. You're not going to replace us. Okay. Well, that person has a kind of Hobbesian view of the world. Okay. In this sense that, okay, for centuries and centuries and centuries, we've been oppressing the black folks. Okay. So that means that if the black folks get any power, they're going to oppress us. Okay. And, that's Hobbes, that's Thucydides, that's kind of any realist view of the nature of politics, which is that people will grab the power they can. Okay. And of course, the notion that people will grab the power they can, okay, creates all kinds of paranoia and suspicion about the other. Okay. No, those liberals don't want just a rainbow flag. They want my kids. Okay. They want to get my kids. They want to wrap my kids in rainbows, right? So my kids come home and call me a bigoted old fool and so whatever paranoid fears that person has. Okay. And that is a result. Partly that's a result of extreme polarization. That guy in Alabama has burrowed into a kind of echo chamber where, these people over here only talk to these people over here, and they get increasingly suspicious of outsiders, and they increasingly start to question what outsiders' real motives are. They say they want X, but they really want Y. They say they're going to stop here, but they're really going to go there. Okay, so I build this whole kind of paranoid narrative. Okay. That's the product of polarization. And polarization is the product of the conception that history and the development and progress of society is a Manichaean struggle. Okay? It's a struggle of A versus B, and A and B are fundamentally and constitutionally and perhaps even ontologically opposed to each other. Okay? Now, if you're on the other side, okay, mm-hmm. you certainly think the same thing. Okay, those conservatives down there in Alabama, they're coming for abortion, and they're coming for these 10 other things too. Okay, and sometimes you're right about that. Sometimes just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you, and that's okay. So you have this situation where two groups of people. Okay. And you can see the same dynamic in Canada. And you probably, if I go to the UK, you see the same dynamic between people who tend to support Brexit and people who tend not to support Brexit. Right? So there you are. If history is a struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between the city of God and the city of man, and I'm in the city of God, then you're in the city of man, right? And then you get a kind of paranoid feedback loop in which each group of people, increasingly read into the other the worst possible motives. Okay? Mm-hmm. And of course, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because people will indeed over time start acting, people will start acting out our very worst ideas of them. Okay? So it becomes this kind of mutually reinforcing suspicion loop in which, yes, the more outrageous the Trump supporter becomes, okay, the more the woke campus liberal attacks him in ways that live up to his stereotype about that person, right? So we start a process in which each person is imposing their stereotypes of each other on the other, and people are increasingly living up to those stereotypes. So the guy in Alabama is increasingly becoming the Christian fascist, okay, that the guy in New York thinks he is, right? Because in these suspicion loops, we start living up to our worst expectations of each other, okay? And the same on the other guy, that liberal guy is becoming smug about rural people, right? He's becoming more and more dismissive of the concerns of people in certain kinds of communities and so on and so forth, right? Because he identifies them increasingly with his own worst idea of them, okay? And like, maybe there's two things you could say about that. One thing you could say about that is, well, yeah, that's just how it goes. Society's war, right? And, maybe the Democrats win, maybe the Republicans win, but there's no mediation between those two categories, right? There's no, right? Because it really just is a struggle of A versus B, in which, A will place itself among the children of light, the forces of good, and B, and so on and so forth. Each side will do that, okay? So that leads to the next two problems, right? Mm-hmm. Which is the formation of political communities into increasingly polarized sects, right? And also the notion of fantasies of erasure, right? Eliminating the other side, mm-hmm. right? Getting rid of the other side, getting rid of that group of people, right? Anyway, but do you have anything to comment on, like, the second one?
It seemed to me like, okay, this idea of God and man, city of God, city of man, is this rooted in this old distinction between, like, in Latin, natura and God? And so, and then all this political movement of man being nature and the state of nature being this kind of, it just seems rooted in that kind of distinction.
Okay. So, yeah, a kind of notion of, the natural, which we discussed with it, natural state of things is war.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
The natural state of things is a battle between those forces that want to go forward towards the future and those forces that want to regress to the past. Mm-hmm. Okay? Mm-hmm. And of course, that divides us into two camps in a society, where you get two mutual suspicion loops between the camps, in which eventually they start becoming each other's caricature of each other.
Yes.
Right? The Alabama guy who voted for Trump just says more and more outrageously racist, dumb, and, awful things, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And the other guy, the New York Times guy, becomes increasingly preachy and self-righteous and moral and obnoxious. And so they just, right, okay. In other words, as the polarity hardens, the polarity intensifies as each person becomes the stereotype that the other has of them.
Yes.
Okay. And in a sense, all their interactions with each other are geared towards producing that end result. Okay. The liberal New Yorker wants to push that guy from Alabama till he says something racist. The guy from Alabama wants to push that guy from New York until he says something smug and dismissive.
So on either side, this conversation is me finding in you what I'm looking for.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right.
And whatever that comes.
So that produces what we call polarization.
Yes.
Okay, which is the inability of different camps in a society to talk to each other, because there is so little basic trust there. There is so much contempt, okay, built up on either side, mm-hmm. that, right, there's no mediation in the present. There's only some kind of victory projected in the future. So for the right-wing guy in Alabama, that's when Jesus comes back and he throws those liberal professors into hell, okay? For the other side, that's, 50 years from now, when all the rednecks have died off and they've been replaced by, rainbow valuing progressive children, right? So each one has a form or myth of victory, right? Which is a form or a myth of erasure.
Yeah.
Okay? Jesus will come put those people in their place.
So this gets us to...
Demographics will get rid of evangelical Christians and Southern bigots and whatever.
Yeah.
Right. So each has got its own narrative, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And I'm interested, and I could talk, and I have talked in other pieces about the conservative narrative there. Like in this piece, I just happen to be talking about the quote unquote progressive version of that narrative, right? Which is, we are the vanguard of the future. Okay? And there is some natural, inevitable, perhaps divine, perhaps whatever, material dialectic or whatever. There is some process that guarantees us victory and triumph and overcoming. Okay? And that's written into the nature of things. Right? So we will win. The next generation will be progressive. And then the generation after that will be more progressive, and so on and so on. Right? And so it goes back to what I said about the pothole. Okay. Mm-hmm. So when I mentioned like you fix a pothole, right? That's progress. Well, now it's regress, right? Like you put the pothole back in its original state.
The road is being restored.
The road is being restored. Okay. Yeah. But that restoration is actually a movement forward, because that restoration of the road is a kind of sign or symbol of the possibilities of the future in which there are no potholes. Yeah. Right? Or that potholes are dealt with really efficiently and well and quickly, and as transportation and high-speed trains, all that stuff. Okay? So there we are. Okay? What we are doing now is a kind of a scatological sign. It's a kind of sacrament. It's a kind of symbol, right, of what will be in the future. Okay, so my interactions now with that guy from Alabama, if they are based on that framing, are based on the fundamental assumption that in 50 years from now, I won't have to deal with that guy, because that guy won't exist, right? Stubborn, recalcitrant, bigoted people won't exist, right? They're fated to die out, okay? And of course, if you take the most extreme, Marxist-Leninist view of that, like you round up all those, you put them in camps, okay? And and by the way, that guy in Alabama is the same thing, right? He's like, put all the goddamn liberals in a concentration camp and kill them, is probably something that's brewing in the mind of some guy down there as we speak, okay? Yeah. So the myth of regress has its myth of erasure, but the myth of progress also has its myth of erasure. Okay? Now, that's blinding us to reality, because there is no erasure. As I point out in the piece, there will always be stubborn, recalcitrant people. Okay? There will always be people who prefer the particularities of their local community or ethnic identity to what's outside of it. Right? And the reason for that is simple. When I was a grad student, I did a course on Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety, and he laid that out beautifully, right? Human life is a synthesis, A or B, right? Do I choose A? Do I choose B? Right? And of course, anxiety is the dizziness that comes with that consciousness of, right? So say the opposition in relationship to which I posit myself is self and other, right? So I got my identity, he's got his identity, okay? Now, I can always posit that synthesis in freedom, Kierkegaard says, in such a manner as to put B over A or A over B, right? I can't put self before neighbor. That possibility is built into the very structure of my freedom. I can prefer my own race to somebody else's race. I can prefer my own ethnicity to somebody else's ethnicity, or the opposite, right? Like that is structurally, transcendentally built in there, right? So if the notion of progress is getting rid of, say, selfish, bigoted, or self-absorbed, or other kinds of people, then literally there is not going to be any kind of progress, right? That's for the most fundamental, basic reason. For as long as there are communities of language, communities that speak this language over here and communities that speak that language over there, belongs transcendentally to the structure of freedom, that either they can embrace each other or reject each other in the name of strengthening their own particular identity. That's always going to happen. Okay? So there's no John Lennon world imagine. Okay? For the reason that, like Kierkegaard explains, like you could get rid of all the religions, you could have one world language. You could have, completely colorblind society. You'd have all of these things, right? But that tendency to will the particular over the universal, that tendency to will self over other, or the familiar over the strange, or whatever, right? That tendency is always going to be there. It's always going to attach itself to something, right? So if progress is replacing that guy from Alabama, that's never going to happen, because some version of that guy is always going to exist, okay? And it might not be the version now. It might not be the Trump voting version, right? But some other version of that guy is always going to exist, because it's one of the possibilities of human freedom to be that kind of person, okay? And, communes fall apart, right? Because even though there's no private property, even though there's no jealousy, even though it's like someone still finds a way to be a shit, right? And the reason somebody still finds a way to be a shit is that somebody always finds a way to be stubbornly individualistic in particular, right? Because that's just constitutionally how we're made, okay?
Back to the Golden Palace.
Back to the Golden Palace. There's no Golden Palace, okay? So if the reason I am engaging with that guy from Alabama in a kind of negatively self-reinforcing loop is that I think he's the last example of that. And this is just, this is the final battle in which I will finally, erase or eliminate or get rid of that kind of embarrassing, awkward person. No. Okay, then so what do you do then? Okay. And so I mentioned shopkeepers, right? Shopkeepers, you work in the shop.
Yes.
Yeah, right? Okay.
And we all at least
parallel shopkeepers. We all know the character of the quote-unquote petty bourgeois.
Yeah.
Right? He's hardworking. He's dedicated to his family in certain ways. He's proud of what he does. He's proud of his little shop, but in a very narrow kind of way that's potentially very, selfish politically, or narcissistic, or absorbed, or right. Because remember, that guy who owns that little shop, that's his temple, but it's not your temple. So he secretly resents the people who work for him because it's his temple and not theirs. And he worships it, but they don't. They're just there for the money, right? So there's something very narrow-minded and potentially bigoted and reactionary about the petty bourgeoisie, the small shopkeeper, okay? So do we get rid of that class person, right? If your problem is, if you think that, certain kinds of property relation are connected with certain kinds of attitudes in people, well, if I just get rid of those property relations, if I just get rid of that kind of person, okay, then problem solved, right? So then you get the notion that, we should vandalize and loot shops, okay? And then, but funnily enough, the guy with his little sporting store or whatever, and the BLM people, or I don't know if it's not necessarily BLM people, but people who are along for that ride in some sense. Okay, they burned down his little sports store, right? That guy suddenly converts to progressivism, right? No.
Probably not.
No. Right? No. He comes back 10 times more right wing. Okay?
This is back to the myth of the erasure.
It's back to the myth of the erasure. Yeah. So you're not going to get rid of evil by getting rid of some class or category of people that you think embodies or carries evil. Okay? But I've talked to Marxists, and we really need to loot more shops because petty small shopkeepers are a reactionary element in society because they always vote right wing, blah blah blah. Okay, and if that's your framing, you're never going to ask yourself, well, how do I convince small shopkeepers not to see more rights and progress for their workers as a threat to them, but as actually something that's going to benefit them too, right? Because that's the argument around minimum wage, right? You have to you have to reassure the shopkeeper who's like, get this little petty obsession with his bottom line. And, oh, he's so worried that if he's going to pay 25 cents more, let's go. Right. Okay. Yeah. You got to convince that guy that, no, it's going to work out for you better in the long run. Okay. And so that kind of political action, where you don't assume an absolute kind of Manichaean, polarized city of God, city of man notion of class conflict, right? Like whereby all a worker can do ultimately is smash that shop and loot that shop and get rid of that guy, right? I know people who are shopkeepers, and I know why they're worried, because sometimes their margins are very thin. Right. And I think like one aspect of social policy is, well, okay, we want to have, if we want to have, workers earning a living wage, and like the shopkeeper, like he's not so selfish that he doesn't want the worker to earn a living wage. He just doesn't want to, he doesn't want his bottom line too badly affected by it. Well, if we have to help small businesses and small shopkeepers to pay living wages for people with tax breaks or other kinds of benefits, then I think that's the correct social policy, right? Correct social policy is to mediate between the interests of those two groups of people, okay? On the assumption that the things that people are always going to have some kind of sense of proprietorship over or in relation to the things that they labor on. Like, I'm not a big fan of Locke, but I think Locke is right about that, right? If I got my little corner store there and there's my picture of my wife and big picture of my kids, and I come here every day, right? Okay. Like, that's my thing. I don't think there's any rooting out the sense of proprietorship over that thing, okay? Mm-hmm. But social policy has to be, well, take what's positive in that feeling and expand upon it. Okay? Now, like we have parties now that all they do is appeal to the selfish side of the shop owner, right? Minimum wage is just going to cut your profits and drive you out of business. Okay? There's parties that they'll send that message, right? Don't worry, I'll protect you from rises in the minimum wage. I'll protect you from taxes. I'll protect you from this. I'll protect you from that, right? Mm-hmm. Where you're appealing to that kind of narrow, more selfish side of the petty bourgeois shop owner, okay? And people will do well off of that, okay? But that's not, like, I don't think that's kind of, written in the structure of things either, okay? So, like, for like, I don't think there's a viable version of social democracy, say, where we, just nationalize the corner stores or something, right? I mean, there's always going to be small enterprises of some kind, because there always have been, even pre-capitalism. There's a butcher there who sells his meat, or there's, a blacksmith there who's, making horseshoes for you, whatever. Right. So there's always going to be small enterprises of some kind over which people have feelings of proprietorship. Okay. And of which people are protective, and of which some people are going to be protective in a negatively fearful way. Okay. Now, I think social policy is to build on what's positive in that feeling. Okay.
Such as
you love your little shop.
Yeah.
You love your business. You want to grow your business, right? Pay your workers better. And if you're having trouble with that, we'll help you out. Okay. Mm-hmm. And you will see in the long run that you will have more committed employees. Your employees will have more spending power. They'll spend in your shop. All these good things are going to happen, right? If you can overcome that kind of fearfulness and protectiveness and anxiety about change and about the future. So, like, I think a lot of progressive politics is addressing and allaying that kind of anxiety. Okay? Except not if your aim is, the victory of workers over somebody else. Okay? Where it's just like written in the material dialectic that this person is your enemy, and you have to overcome them. You have to, close down the little mom and pop shop because you want to get rid of the petty bourgeois as a class because they impede progress. They're a regressive reactionary force and element in society, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So, and like, here's part of the reason I want to emphasize this. Okay? In that progressiveness or progressive politics or whatever you want to call it, okay, to the extent that it is investing in an imagined future, is creating a real problem for itself in the present, which is that we are dealing with highly time-sensitive issues like climate change. Progressive parties need a big win now. Okay? And to get a big win now, they're going to have to get support from, I don't know, petty shop owners. They're going to have to get support from rural people. They're going to have to get support from people who work for Suncor, right? I'm from Cape Breton. I know people back home, they work for Suncor. We've discussed this before, right? Suncor that pays for their, four-wheeler or their snowmobile or whatever, right? And they reflexively support the industry propaganda because that's the thing they're dependent on. Okay? So if you're serious about it, and never mind the future, just preserving what we have now, right, against potential ecological catastrophe, right? I was just reading the other day in The Guardian, George Monbiot or whatever, he says, time is now, right? Well, if the time is now, you got to win now. You got to win an election in the next couple cycles, okay? Mm-hmm. And so you don't have time to wait for all the rednecks to disappear, or all the evangelical Christians to disappear, or all the bourgeois petty shop owners to disappear, right? You don't have time to wait, right, for whatever natural course of things is going to cause the erasure or disappearance of whatever inconvenient category of people. You got to win some of those people over. Maybe you don't need to win all of those people over, but you need to win some of them over, right? Because you got to do something in the next decade.
Yeah. And appeals to their humanity beats this kind of Manichaean.
Well, yeah. No. Okay, because what we are in danger of producing is punitive, retributive, judgmental socialism that's about exclusion. Mm-hmm. Sam Adler, American, I think he's American, wrote a piece on this, right? How when you're trapped in, and we could be up front here. We could call this the myth of the avant-garde, right? The people who are always at the forefront, always the crest of the wave, and they're always a bit ahead of the curve, and they're always anticipating what the next twist in vocabulary is, what the next letter is that's going to be added to LGBTQT. I don't even know what it is now, right? But they do because they're ahead of the curve, right?
So kind of symbolic. Progressivism, like being the symbol of,
embodied in the notion of a kind of avant-garde, right? Mm-hmm. Or what I call a myth of the sacred few, myth mm-hmm. of the vanguard, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. That a small group of highly progressive, highly energized, highly motivated people are the primary engine of progress, and they're struggling against the stale forces of convention and selfishness and lack of imagination and all of this, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. A group like that, of its very nature, has to be small. If it becomes big, it's no longer an avant-garde.
It has to be micro.
It has to be micro.
Not
and
even
it has to fracture into micro segments.
Yeah.
Okay. Of its very nature, right? Because everyone has to be the person who's at the front. Okay, so everyone has to be the person who's most ahead of the curve. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so of course you get the kind of fragmentation you see on social media, where you have various groups of people, essentially excommunicating each other over differences of vocabulary. Okay, or they took this position instead of taking that position. Okay, they used the word prostitute instead of sex worker or whatever. right? Whatever, or they said Latino instead of Latinx or something or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we don't have time for the avant-garde to become the mainstream, right? Because of course that'll literally never happen, right? Whatever the avant-garde is today, it's got to be something else tomorrow, right? So, so let me in fact, I'll even frame it this way. In any society, there are people whose interests and identities are bound up in the way things are now. Okay? There's another group of people whose interests or identity would be better served by certain changes. Okay? Then there are yet more people whose interests and identities would be served by fundamental changes, right? But of course, an avant-garde is a step ahead of all those things, right? Because for the avant-garde, the state of revolution is perpetual, right? We can never settle into patterns of custom, patterns of convention, or anything like this, right? So the change, so there always has to be a change beyond the change, right? After this change, there has to be a next change. Most people are satisfied at some point, okay? Right? Like those three groups of people I mentioned before, they're all satisfied at some point, right? I got that road filled and I got a school built, and now I'm happy. Okay? Or I got a clinic in my town now, right? Now I'm happy. Okay. So the shockwave of progressivism is never going to be big. It's always of its very nature going to be small, right? And it's going to consist of those people who, as a point of principle, are not going to be satisfied when they get that medical clinic in their community, or when they get their water problem fixed, or whatever, right? Because there's always a new thing to move on to, right? The problem that's true in the arts too, and all kinds of things, right? Because, in a certain sense, I'm also talking about the aesthetic avant-garde, which I love. I love the aesthetic avant-garde, right? I don't want to listen to country songs necessarily, right? But, okay. At the same time, most people are happy with country songs. Okay. So in a democratic society, right, if you bought into the myth of the avant-garde or the vanguard or the advance wave, right, well, of necessity, you're a fringe party. Of necessity, you're like the Greens. You're pulling 8 or 9% in the polls, right? And the best you can hope for is that we create some kind of system of proportional representation where I can be in a, right? Where I can, be in a coalition of some kind and I can push, okay? I don't think we have time for that. I think we need to get not the avant-garde on board with certain kinds of changes, but my cousins who work at Suncor, right? We have to get them on board for something, right? And that thing can't be threatening to them. That thing can't be shut down the oil patch and throw you out of work. It can't be that, okay? It's got to be something else.
Well, culturally, it can't be the elitism of just your concerns do not matter.
Oh, absolutely. And in a certain sense, that kind of, if you still want to use the word progress, right, that kind of progressive effort can't come from me, it can't come from you, right? Because it's going to be received in a certain sense as patronizing or condescending, right? It's got to come from somebody in those communities, okay? And I say this because it's time sensitive. If what Monbiot is saying in The Guardian is true, if what other people are saying is true, we got a decade to figure this effort out, right? And we don't have time to wait for today's avant-garde to become the norm in 50 years, right? We need some other kind of politics than that, right? So what I suggest is, and like the sensitivity of our time framing suggests this, forget about the future. Like, what are we going to do in the now, right? What kind of I know people don't like to use the word compromise, but what kind of compromises are we going to make in the now, right? What kind of ways are we going to get certain kinds of people to tolerate changes or tolerate transformations in society that they're never really going to like, right? Well, I'll tell you how not to do that. Hectoring people on social media, right? Like hectoring people will not do that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You can hector all day. You can get all of the the wokest people to call out others 24/7. That's not going to move the needle even 1 millimeter. Okay. And I'm in a position to know that because I'm from the boonies, right? Right? I know that I just go to my cousins and hector them about Greta Thunberg. That's I'm not gonna get anywhere. They're gonna tell me to F off. And rightly so, right?
And then there's this reinforcement that you referred to earlier.
Yeah.
Mutual reinforcement.
Yeah. So the mutual suspicion loop in which everybody becomes the other's worst parody of them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because people are driving themselves to that because they're trying to increase the polarization. Right? So
just as a close, farewell to progress, question mark.
Because I don't know, because if we focus on the present in the way that I imagine, progress might be the thing that happens. I don't know, right?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Because I'm talking about certain ways of framing progress.
Mm-hmm.
If there's some good change out there in the world and it's called progress, then yeah, sure, right? But I think that myths of progress or frameworks in which we conceive of progress, and they're frequently symbolic frameworks and they're sometimes religious frameworks, okay? I think we at least need to put those aside to some degree, okay? No, this is not about replacing my embarrassing cousins in Cape Breton with some new shiny type of person. Okay? It's always going to be people who are kind of focused on the immediacy of community, right, in the way that they might be, right? And they're not looking at the big picture politically, right? You're never going to get rid of that kind of person. It's always going to be that kind of person, okay? And politics is always going to be the art of persuading that kind of person, the reluctant person, right, to changes that, are going to be in their own interest long term, okay? But anyway, we're in the hour?
Yeah, that's great. Anything else you'd like to say before we close the episode?
No, I'm good.
Awesome. So guys, we're going to link to the blog here, as you know, on every episode we do. So this has been a great one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and thanks for illuminating some of those myths of progress for us.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And maybe the world will get better.
Yeah.
But I think it will get better without those myths.
Almost.
Or it'll get better more quickly without those myths.
Yeah, in spite of the myths.
Yes.
Looking forward to that. And thanks again for doing this. So we'll see you guys next week, I assume.
Yeah.
Anything else to say to the listeners? Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right.
All right.
You've listened to the Parmenius podcast. Bernard Wills. I'm your host, Jordan Sheppard. Thanks a lot.